You've been a host family for international students.
Yes.
Tell me about that and some of your adventures as an international host international student host household.
Well, about 15 or 20 years ago, we learned that Wright State University was looking for families that would host international students to have occasional dinners with them and to get to know them. So that sounded like a good idea, so we signed up, and everybody who signed up was to appear at a certain date at Wright-Patterson, and you would meet the people they had assigned to you. So we were assigned a young man from Nepal, at any rate, northern India, and he was a Sikh. He wore a turban, and he was majoring in engineering, material science. And so we had quite a number of dinners with him and got to know him pretty well, and very often we would have him bring his friends and create dinners. Some of his friends were from Pakistan, and they weren't speaking to people from Pakistan, but these two had grown up together and spoke the same language. But at any rate, we really designed that kitchen so you could have a lot of people cooking at one time. And so we had any number of dinners, both Indian dinners and Chinese dinners, through our friend J.P. We met a lot of other students, some Chinese, some from Thailand, some from elsewhere, and we would invite them to have dinners at our house, and we would contribute dishes also. Well, that was a good time. Since that time, J.P. went to work for General Motors, and he is now the engineering head of all sheet metal operations for General Motors. So we keep track of him and visit him, and vice versa. They come here, he and his wife, and sometimes we go through Michigan and stop there. So that has been a very interesting relationship to follow through time. And we've done that with many other students also. Well, then we learned about a program called International Friendship Incorporated, which essentially runs programs of hosting international students throughout the country at different universities and colleges. So they sent somebody here to Dayton, Ohio, to set up a chapter in at Wright State, and actually she needed a place to live while she was doing this, and we had a room at that time. So that became a hosting in terms of people living here. And well, it was 7 or 8 years ago that was organized, and one of the early things she wanted was a place to hold dinners on Friday night that international students would be invited to attend. So we said, well, we'd be happy to host that. So we accumulated a bunch of plastic chairs and one by one a bunch of tables, and began to cook meals for international students. And after a while she had appointed somebody to get volunteer food from church groups, and we started off with maybe 20 students and got more and more students. The students would bring their friends, because here's a free meal on Friday night with plenty to eat, and other interesting students, many times students from their own country they hadn't met before. This gradually grew up till about 100 students would come in this basement, which you can see is pretty crowded. But after a huge meal, there would be some singing of songs, and then there would be a very short Bible teaching, and then sometimes more music, and then people would play games, everything from chess and checkers to Monopoly and so on. And these international students love to stay here, and I don't know why particularly, except we enjoyed having them and we enjoyed meeting and talking with them. Well, it turns out that a number of them had to write papers all the time, and English was a second language for most of these international students. So they have to have a modicum of English to qualify to come here to study. And all of them were happy to have somebody help them learn English. And so conversations, proofreading of papers for grammar and so on became a steady thing for a lot of people. I discovered that some of those students were graduating and were interviewing for jobs, and so they needed resumes, and I could tune up their resume by taking whatever resume they had and asking them questions about their experience and their studies and so on, and so improving the resume. Well, then I realized that some of them are having trouble with interviews, which would be tough if English is your second language. So I began having interview practice with various students. After a while, we realized that there was a need for, sometimes incoming students have no arrangements for staying in town. They don't know anybody, they don't know anybody in their country, and they need a place to stay until they find a place. So we had two bedrooms, and so we got two students, and after they lived here a while, we got to know them very well, cooked meals together, had conversations. Meanwhile, we went on vacations with some of those students, so we became very close. Mark Al-Ghatani is from Saudi Arabia, so he was our first Arabian student. He's got a master's degree in mechanical engineering. He's back in Saudi Arabia now. He's working for a royal commission that's doing planning for Mecca, city planning for Mecca. And we've gone on several long vacations with him through the southwest and northwest. And so we keep in touch with him practically every week. So these are not like keeping track of pet poodle dogs, but they're real people who have lives of their own. Shenkai, who is sleeping in the basement until his wedding on the 29th of this month, was one of those students that we met very early on and have been in contact with through the time he has been here, which is about 6 or 7 years. Since that time, he has joined the Army Reserve and has been trained, and through that program got a citizenship. So he's a United States citizen. He went back to visit and met this woman who was his designated fiancée by his parents, and they agreed to get married when she could travel again. So she is now back here from China, and they're going to have a wedding in our backyard, and I will perform the wedding. And so I suppose, well, He has a job with a Chinese glass company, auto glass company here in town. He wants to quit that and work for Honda. Honda has a plant, an assembly plant in Delaware, north of Columbus. He would rather be an engineer for them. He's a serious fellow, a graduate engineer, very capable, and a dear, dear friend. And through him and his friends, we've met lots and lots of students. So that's the life of international student relationships that go on, because the students come and then they graduate, and then you keep track of some of them, and then you pick up a new batch.
There's a picture that shows Robert Murray and Roger Brucker at Floyd's tomb in Crystal Cave.
Yeah.
So did you took Robert Murray caving, or at least into that cave?
Well, yes, I tried. He really wasn't interested in going in caves. He was a little claustrophobic, he said. But we were probably 2/3 of the way through the book, and we decided to spend some time together interviewing people in Kentucky. And so he came to Kentucky, and I met him at Bowling Green, and we had a list of people we were individually interviewing. And at that time, I took him down into Crystal Cave, and we took that picture, realizing that it might end up in the book as a picture of the authors. He said, "I'm just leaving the caving to you, and I'll work on the history." Well, of course, we all worked on all of it, except his contribution to the caving was minimal.
I just thought it was an appropriate picture for the two authors and the subject of their...
Yeah. You know, you'll notice the date of death of Floyd Collins is not shown on that monument because they didn't know what day it was that he died. So they have the date he was born and the date when he was buried, but not the date when he died.
When we were at the restaurants, you were telling me about how you collected first-hand accounts of the people who were involved in the longest cave connection trip, and you had did similar stuff to for the Roppel connection. Could you repeat that or tell me that story again for the camera?
One of the problems in writing a cave exploring book is whether or not you have dialogue in the book of the cave exploring individuals. And while it's possible to write stories about trips and make up the dialogue, that really isn't a very authentic way to write a book. So what Red Watson and I knew, well, first of all, in writing The Caves Beyond, I had tons of reference material, tape recordings of long conversations with people. I knew all of the participants who were in that expedition and had talked with them. So I had not much trouble creating the dialogue that appears in that book. And when it came to writing The Longest Cave, both Watson and I realized that while we had first-hand trip reports written by the leader of every survey trip that went in the cave, we did not have the dialogue that went with it. So what we decided to do is to write the dialogue that was necessary to carry that part of the story, and then This was in the days when there were no Xerox machines. You had to use carbon copy sets, and so we had a 10 carbon copy set in which we typed the book. So we had plenty of copies of the book chapters as we went, and we would send the chapters in manuscript form to the individuals who were on the trip. And while we made up some of the conversation, we would ask people to either authenticate it or edit it to reflect what actually corresponded to their memory of what they said. And they were very good about that. We would get mail back nearly every day from the last batch we sent out. So essentially we knew the value of first-person authentication of dialogue. Some readers of The Longest Cave accused us of tape recording everybody's cave trip, which they said was impossible. So they said, you must have made it all up. Well, the answer is no, we didn't. We may have started at that point, but these chapters were submitted to the people who were there, and they had their chance to revise the conversation, and they did. So it was pretty authentic. Well, when I first met Bob Murray and we were deciding to write the Floyd Collins book together, Trapped, I asked him, how do you write history? And he said, you get as close to the original material as you possibly can. He explained that that involved talking with whoever survived from that era, looking at any records that were contemporaneous to that time, and so on. And I realized that Sand Cave itself would be valuable to understand because there were conflicting descriptions of Sand Cave. One person say, well, I walked into the cave until I heard Floyd Collins moaning. And you could, if you knew about Sand Cave, you know there's no place to walk in Sand Cave. Nobody walked into Sand Cave. So that was somebody making up the story out of the whole cloth. If somebody said the cave was like crawling through a corn crib, that was a pretty accurate description of the cave, and that was somebody who actually had been in the cave. I was scared every minute I was in the cave. That's an authentic comment, because it's a frightening cave, because it is, the cave goes through a lot of unconsolidated material and pieces drop out of the ceiling on you as you're going through the tight crawlways. So at the time we made the connection to Mammoth Cave was made in September 9, 1972, there were 6 people on that trip, and I knew we were going to have to write that trip into detail. So I sent a letter to all 6 of the people, and also to Tom Brucker, who had been on the previous trip that set up that connection trip, to please write a memoir of your recollections of that trip, everything you can think of that went on before, during, and after that trip. So after some nudging of some of the participants, I had 7 complete memoirs written, and so what to do with those? Well, by that time I had a copy machine, and I could copy the memoirs and cut them up into a continuity that is pasted together, a kind of a big poster of the parts of this trip report from beginning to end to afterwards that represented the collective individual reports of all 7 people. So the 2 chapters of the book describing this trip on September 9 starting September 8 and ending September 9, were written from these first-person accounts. So almost none of that dialogue would be considered fiction or made up. And all of it was approved by the individuals that the dialogue is attributed to. Well, many years later, when we connected Donkey Cave to Mammoth Cave, I made sure to contact all of the people who participated in that for a memoir. Some of the people said, well, I just carried the rope. I didn't really do anything in connecting it. Well, I want a memoir from every individual who participated. So I eventually got that, and then was able to write an account of connecting that cave together. I did more or less the same thing when we connected to Roppel Cave, although since Lynn and I were on the trip, we pretty well knew the individuals and had talked to all of them prior to writing that part of the book. So that's the story. So no, we did not take tape recorders along on cave trips. And yes, we did use trip reports, and we did submit most of the dialogue to the individual who had a chance to approve it or correct it.
Where did you write up about the connection with Donkey Cave?
Where did I write it up? I wrote it up here.
I mean, where was it published?
Oh. It was probably published in its entirety in the Cave Research Foundation newsletter. I'm not sure it has appeared anyplace else.
All right.
Well, I was going to tell you about authenticating the Roppel, the book Beyond Mammoth Cave. When Borden and I decided to write that book together about the connection of Mammoth Cave to Roppel Cave, I had told him about how we need to submit dialogue that involves trip reports that involve individuals. We needed to submit those to those individuals who we're talking about. He was concerned because at that time he and Jim Kearns, that is Jim Borden and Jim Kearns, had done practically all of the early work in discovering and exploring Roppel Cave. And through disagreements, they had grown to literally hate each other in a worst severe way. Kearns wouldn't speak to Borden, Borden wouldn't speak to Jim Kearns. Well, I knew both of them, and I realized that to write the book, I was going to have access to Jim Kearns, and that he didn't want anything to do with anything that Jim Borden had something to do with. So I made it my business to become friends with Jim Kearns and to cement that relationship when I took him back to his home from Mammoth Cave back to Lexington, Kentucky, his home. And I said, well, look, you're in a situation which is we would call an impasse, because you won't speak to Borden, Borden won't speak to you. But I said, I want you to speak to me, and I promise you we will show you the whole manuscript and get your approval on it before we print anything. He said, well, I'm really nervous about that because Borden is going to kill me in that book. Well, I got his confidence to the point that I could both send him manuscript and talk to him on the phone every once in a while. He expressed concern every time that Borden was going to give him a savage blow in the book at any moment. In fact, when the manuscript was complete and I sent him a copy of the manuscript, he was literally afraid to read it, and he handed the manuscript to Hilary Lambert, whom he knew in Lexington, asked her to read it and tell him whether or not he was trashed in the book. So she read the manuscript and she said to Jim Kearns, there are a lot of people mentioned in that book, but you're the only one who comes out as being sane. Everybody else has an obsession and is more or less insane about exploring and going the extra mile and going through this terrible set of cave mud and circumstances and water, and so you come out as the normal person. So at any rate, he finally agreed that the book was about as well written as he could imagine it would be. I don't know whether Borden and Kearns ever made up. It seemed to me that they probably never would.
How did you like the play Trapped about Floyd Collins?
Well, I thought it was very entertaining, but what bothered me about it was that I could spot pieces of the book used verbatim in the play, and they had never arranged permission to use the book Trapped as the basis for that musical. Their claim was that, they used a lot of sources, and the book was very helpful, but they never admitted that the book was really the basis for the whole musical. After we went to New York and saw the play, and saw that they had essentially lifted all the photographs in the book and put them up in the lobby as part of the promotion. Bob Murray and I talked this over and decided we would hire a lawyer and go after these people, because they had clearly stolen the book and claimed that it was just one of many sources, and we could tell it was about the only source they used. That and a Reader's Digest article and miscellaneous tidbits here and there. But we thought we had a pretty good case, and so we were recommended a litigator in New York, an attorney who specialized in literary property, and he agreed to take the case for a $5,000 retainer, and we each put up half of that and sent him the money, and he went to work on the case. Well, he called up after a while and he said, I have some bad news for you. He said, you're going to have enough money to fight the Richard Rogers organization. Richard Rogers was one of the authors of Oklahoma and Carousel and many other famous musicals throughout the years. And this was a multi-million-dollar corporation. So we didn't have infinite resources that you would need to fight that kind of legal battle. He said the second set of bad news was you have to bring the suit where the offense was committed. The play was staged in New York City, so you have to bring it in the Federal District of New York, and you're not going to win. That's because there's a precedent in the Federal District of New York that anything that claims to be factual cannot be copyrighted, based on the famous Yellow Pages case where a competitor decided to put out a telephone book and call it something else, but was really lifted out of the Yellow Pages. And the Yellow Pages people sued, and they lost the case because of that ruling by the judge that nothing that was claimed to be factual could be copyrighted. And that precedent had ruled in several other cases brought in New York. So at that point we abandoned the attempt to litigate this and resorted to me appearing at public performances of this musical. I probably appeared at least 20 different stage versions of the musical and talked afterwards to the audience, sometimes before. In one case, I spent a week contributing to the publicity efforts to build an audience for one of the places where this was put on. I think they paid me $1,000 to come down there for a week. But in Chicago, Tina Landau, one of the authors of that musical, admitted that they had based the play on the book Trapped, and that was their Bible, as in her terms. In writing it, she, on the behalf of she and Adam Giddle, thanked Brucker and Murray for writing the book. So that was a turning point as far as I was concerned. It really wasn't a matter of money. We just wanted people to know that the book was the basis for that story. Oklahoma was based on a book called Green Grow the Lilacs. While it was acknowledged at the time, it never received wide knowledge that that was the case. I'm not saying they stole it. They may have made an arrangement, but they certainly made no arrangement with Murray and Brucker.